Mystery is something that I have been studying over the last 2 years or so, and working on a mystery fantasy mashup novel right now.
I'm Amanda Downen. I have several short stories out in the world. Also, better?
Yes.
And also, I have a trilogy called The Necromancer Chronicles out from Orbit, and those I have pitched as James Bond with necromancy. So, and the spy thriller is somewhat analogous to mystery plotting in a certain way, and I enjoy it very much. As for my personal history, I grew up reading my mother's books and being read to, and she loved Tolkien and Le Guin and C.S. Lewis and also Agatha Christie. So those influences have just been percolating in the back of my brain since I was 8 years old.
And hi, my name is Tad Williams. I'm primarily known as a fantasy writer, although I like to think I've dabbled in a few other areas too, and that's worth something. But and perhaps because, very similarly to Amanda, I've had a background in mystery going back to childhood. Mystery and the technical writer side of doling out bits of clues and foreshadowings and things like that has always been a very strong part of my fantasy writing and one of my favorite parts of it, so that's what I'm here for.
And I am, as I said, Diana Farrell Francis, and I include mystery in a lot of my novels, but in particular, my latest release, which is called The Witch King Murders, is a police procedural fantasy. So I was deliberately trying to pull those things together. And I'm sort of dabbling in writing romantic suspense in contemporary type fiction, but that's here and there. All right, so this is a kind of large topic. So I'm going to start by asking all of you, what are the ways, I mean, this is broad, because like you said thrillers, I think spy thrillers are under the mystery umbrella, personally. So what are the ways that you have seen fantasy and mystery combined, and maybe both successfully and less successfully? So we'll start with you, Dan.
Okay, seeing it combined. Gosh, I was actually thinking it's a shame that Steve Bruce is not here to be on this panel, because Steve has kind of made a lifetime specialty out of writing a sort of crime and mystery fiction that is very much fantasy. His Vlad Tatosh novels, which those of you who have not read, who like crime fiction and fantasy both, you will find a lovely intermingling of the two in those books. Plus they're funny, and they have a lot of food in them as well. For some of us, that kind of lights all our candles. So. And one of the things I like about it, and one of the things that I think I also try to do in my own work, is to, Steve is very good at incorporating these things into the book in a number of different ways without explicitly starting out and saying, here is the mystery. As most mysteries tend to do, at least those that follow the traditional format, they tend to hand you a puzzle and say, can you solve this before whoever the main protagonist is or protagonists, and before they solve it. And so Steve has found a number of really innovative ways to do it that I always loved. And one of my favorite was a book of his that started with a laundry list. And it was a list of several, many items of clothing of various kinds. So it would be, a glove, finger burnt, a tunic with a slash through it, this and that, stained by blood. It's this whole laundry list of things his character had taken to the laundry after the adventure you're about to read about. And then basically chapter by chapter by chapter, you find out how all of these horrible things happened to the clothes he was wearing as he's pursuing this mystery through the thing. So what he's actually done there is he has already given you a mystery before the story begins that is not the mystery that is central to the story. It's just a little additional one that you don't even kind of realize until you're part of the way through the book. And he says the first time, and that totally ruined my tunic. And you go, ah! So I think as with any blending of genres, the more seamlessly it gets done, the better it works. And I think that Bruce is a very good example, but since you caught me by surprise on that one, and I thought we were going to talk a little bit more about our own work, I'm having trouble thinking of examples, but if you don't mind, by the time everybody's finished, I'll probably think of another couple of things I'd like to mention. Okay.
Okay, Amanda.
One of my favorites would be Elizabeth Bear's New Amsterdam series, the Abigail Irene Garrett books, which are alternative history, fantasy, detective fiction, and I think she pulled that off extraordinarily well. And I know I've noticed a lot of very Holmes-inspired fantasy novels coming out lately, and I haven't read them all yet, but I'm extremely curious to keep track of that.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways fantasy mystery is not new. I think historically we have been asked to put genres into different categories, for the sales force, for the bookstores, so that there can be a match between the reader and the type of story. And I think that has been loosening up over time, and there's a lot more crossover between genres. And I think that one of those examples would be you have a mystery in almost any kind of a story you write. I mean, it's a question of degree, right? How much of it is fantasy and how much of it is mystery? You look at something that's almost a pure fantasy, and it's going to have the same, there's clues, and to follow a plot, there's going to be revelation of information through all of these, through the plot. If you've got something that's more of a mystery, I think in recent times, more fantastical elements have been starting to come into them. And then, of course, you have the whole genre of urban fantasy, which is a real tight mesh, I think, of mystery and fantasy.
And that's a great point about finding a distinction between the elements of mystery that infuse a fantasy story and something that's truly a blend of disparate genres. Fantasy bringing in a sense of wonder, and mystery bringing in a sense of puzzle pieces snapping together and that really intense satisfaction as a reader when you recognize that pattern and it all comes together. A great example of that for me is Edgar Catero's Method and Kids, which is kind of a pastiche of a number of different, not just Scooby-Doo mysteries, but a couple other children's book mysteries. But all those characters are aged up and they all are traumatized because of the actual real Lovecraftian horrors they stumbled across not too long ago. And it's a brilliant book and very greatly written. Check it out.
I also thought I had something else I wanted to throw in here because what we're talking about, as several people have mentioned, is we're talking about a blending of genres. And one of the things, so it doesn't always necessarily have to be a dead body lying on the conservatory floor with a clear lead pipe wound in the back of the head. It doesn't have to be Clue. And one of my absolute favorites, and I'm going a bit far afield here, but it actually, I think, speaks to the point. One of my absolute favorite books of all time is a book called Ridley Walker by an author named Russell Hogan, which some of you probably know without knowing because he and his wife did the amazing children's books, the Frances books, about a badger named Frances. Bread and jam for Frances, baby sister for Frances. They're wonderful. What is very little known is that he also wrote, or comparatively not as known, is he wrote some really wonderful grown-up novels like Turtle Diary, which was a movie, and some others. But Ridley Walker is a story that, as you sort of begin to figure out early on, is clearly set in the distant, distant future. And it's that civilization has collapsed so completely that there is literally no memory of previous civilization. But where the mystery element comes in, and why I think this is particularly unique, is that the first mystery that is set out before you is the bizarre patois that Ridley Walker, the main character, who's a young male in this sort of hunter-gatherer society, speaks. And so the first thing, it's like the first time you read Clockwork Orange, you're really wading through this weird pidgin English, trying to figure out what he's saying and why he's saying it. But what becomes increasingly clear is that if you want to try to figure out what happened to the society that we all know, which is now thousands of years in the past, many of the clues are hidden in the way they talk and the words they use and the kind of almost the grammar and the syntax of their speech. So it's a mystery story where most of the clues are given to you just in the language in which it is told to the reader. So you start out kind of going, why are they making it so difficult for me? And within a few pages, you begin to start putting the pieces together in your mind. And then the entire book, besides being a very good story with a lot of fascinating stuff going on, is also a mystery story where the mystery is actually what happened way back then to make things like they are now. And the only clues you are getting, because the characters don't know. There is no record of the prior civilization. So all the clues are actually in the speech that has, is how the characters talk now. So I just brought that up is because it's an example of blending two genres, in this case kind of fantasy, kind of science fiction, with the mystery. But the mystery is not a dead body. The mystery is what happened to humanity.
I like that. Two things I was thinking about. First of all, going back, Dracula is a mystery. I'm a Victorianist by education, by the way. But it is a mystery because the question is what is happening to the women, and so there's all this investigation into what is it, and various mysteries throughout the book. So yes, the mystery goes back quite a ways into a lot of classical books. The second thing I want to mention, as a book that I think is really done well and is really recent, was Kat Richardson's Blood Orbit, which is a Sherlock Holmes variety. We have a android type of character, and then we have a more human type of character investigating crimes on a planet where it's becoming pretty significantly dangerous for the entire planet, right? But it still follows the investigation, kind of the police procedural investigation. And I've mentioned police procedural before, and then there's cozy mystery. So in a minute, we're going to ask about different varieties of things and how we use the various elements. But what you were saying a minute ago, Anne, about them being particularly complementary, Orson Scott Card wrote this great essay about how science fiction and fantasy readers read. And we go into a world and we know nothing about it. And we know we are reading for clues. And what we do is we hold things in abeyance. We pick things up and we hold them in our minds, waiting until we can put the pieces together. And which is why, in this particular essay, he's talking about why metaphor doesn't really work, because if someone has alligator legs, a reader is going to not see the metaphor for dry, scaly skin, but rather actual alligator legs. So, but the point is why one of the reasons I think they're so complementary is because the science fiction fantasy reader is already looking for clues and putting clues together. That's the way that science fiction fantasy gets read. Mystery readers do the same thing. So they're already processing the narrative in the very same way. So I think that's one of the main reasons it's very complementary. All right, so we haven't really talked about the various kinds, and I want to kind of throw you a very muddled question. I want you to talk about some of the various kinds in relation to the things that you write. Do you know what I mean? Because there's a whole variety, and like you said, the spy thriller, and then there's cozies, and then there's police procedurals, and there's a whole variety of things. So I want you to think about that and kind of talk about the varieties that are out there, and maybe the ways that you have used those to come into your works and take advantage of those. And by the way, speaking of urban fantasy comes right out of the hard-boiled detective novel. That's where it came out of. That's its roots. So it's definitely well connected. So Amanda, would you like starting that question, that very muddled question?
Sure. I think for me, I definitely use some procedural structure and definitely a lot of thriller structure. And one of the reasons—
What's thriller structure for you?
For me, it's less about solving a mystery, or the characters may be solving a mystery, but the information is not necessarily being withheld from the reader. The reader may have a broader sense of what's going on as the characters are trying to piece it together, and also generally more, I I would say, more action-heavy, possibly larger stakes.
And there's oftentimes a ticking clock. That's a very big thriller.
And I would say personally, the reason that I tend to fall back on that is I have a hard time withholding that information from the reader. I tend to prefer multiple points of view. And as I'm muddling through my discovery draft, trying to figure out what's going on, I tend to put that information in the draft so that I will have it. And then I may not necessarily be able to gracefully take it out at the end. And then I've tried to write like a straightforward mystery, and my agent told me, like, you should probably just make this a thriller because I think you can figure out what's going on here. And I have not yet dabbled in cozies, and that's very intriguing. I may go there someday.
There are a lot of cozy fantasy mysteries getting written right now. It's really kind of one of those places that's really bursting, which I find interesting.
Yeah, The Bourne Identity. I have to confess, I haven't read the book, but I did see the movie, and it becomes immediately clear right away up front who the bad guys are and what it is they want. Because remember the famous saying, Act 2 belongs to the villain? The antagonist is such a huge engine of energy in a story. So yes, in a thriller, you know, if you've got the bigger picture, you know what the villain wants. Having said that, another distinction I would say between a thriller and a mystery is mysteries often take place after a crime has been committed, as opposed to a thriller, which is more preventative. You know if a crime is going to be committed, and you need to, save the Mona Lisa before it's stolen, or the head of state before they're killed, or whatever that happens to be. I think a perfect, well, maybe not perfect, but an interesting example of where you might want to set a cozy science fiction mystery, say, might be on a spaceship, because a cozy is defined by the fact that it's a limited area, and the closed room. There's only so many solutions. So something like that.
There's actually there's a science fiction novel called Dark Orbit, and I'm forgetting the author's name. The last name is Gilman, which is there's other plot points going on, but it is using a spaceship as a locked room murder mystery, and I like that structure quite a bit.
One of the things that I use to think about this, and for those of you that were the Mixing Genres panel, you already heard this, but I tend to think of a set of obligatory scenes that need to be found in a genre or to be satisfying to genre readers. So if we talk about thrillers, so you have a ticking clock, and you have stakes. Most genres have about 5 to 7. So you have fantasy and thriller, and if they click together, they zip up together like a zipper. If you're missing one or two of them, they'll still connect, but it's going to be weaker. Those connective tissues aren't going to be as strong, and they specifically won't be as satisfying for fans of the genre that you're skipping bits over.
Well, I think that in my own work, it's very hard for me to define because I am Mr. Kitchen Sink. So, if it exists out there, if it's a literary trope that I can plunder in any way, shape, or form, I will grab it and it's in my stuff. So I tend to have all these sort of things. There are the sort of locked room puzzle mysteries. I'm very big on the slow dawning mystery where you're given something as a historical fact within the story, and then slowly, not necessarily the characters, but the readers at least, begin to realize that they should not have trusted that initial information. So that's another kind that I like to do. The thriller stuff, obviously, the ticking clock, especially for the kind of big fantasies. When I'm writing the big epic fantasies, that's basically what they are, is they're an overblown thriller with a lot of world building, because there's almost always, but then there are also, this is why it gets hard to talk about, there are several layers of mysteries that lead to the revelation of what the thriller type mystery is. In other words, what the real overwhelming danger is may not be obvious to the characters until a long time into the story. So I like to juggle all of those, and one of the reasons I like to use more than one kind is because it makes it, first of all, a little less obvious what I'm stealing, but it also makes it so that there are different it's almost like, like landmines, but they're all different sizes, right? So you've got this field full of landmines, and some of them are just little boots, and others are big explosions that are dangerous, and some of them will kill you, So the characters are navigating these things, and there are many different things that could be called mysteries that come up. And so sometimes the most interesting ones to some of the readers are the small ones that are important for the characters that they're most involved with. And they kind of take the big mystery as well, that's a given. I'm not going to find out about this till the ending, but I'll get these other little bits along the way. So that's another thing too, I like to mix them and have many different levels of mysterious happenings that I'm strewing clues about. So, because the other thing, especially with the longer books that I write and that anybody probably writes, is with a lot of the puzzle type mysteries, the writers wait till the end. And then you have the proverbial unmasking scene, those meddling kids, or you have the Hercule Poirot in the parlor explaining like, but I've been better than that, and of course it was actually Mr. So-and-so. So, but those are usually, the revelations are held in reserve. But when you're writing a really long story, you cannot have your only mystery be the big one that's going to get solved at the end. You have to have a group of small and medium-sized mysteries that you're paying off as you go, so that first of all, the reader has a chance to check their perceptions, and whether they, oh yeah, that was what I thought it might be, or rather like, whoa, that caught me by surprise. And then also, so they simply get the satisfaction of getting delivery, because one of the things we read genre fiction for is, as I would call it, delivery of certain promises. When you sit down with a genre book, you expect certain things. And that's one of the fun things about being a genre writer, is trying to be as artistic as you can while delivering the things that the audience really wants to have when they pick up a science fiction novel, a mystery novel, a fantasy novel, a crime novel.
And something that you're making me think of is the movie Inception.
Yes.
I mean, that's one that is literally layered.
Yes.
But when you stop and watch it and think all the way through what is the central thread, you can follow it.
Yes.
But oh my goodness, it's got all of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just sort of the smoke and mirrors, look over here because I don't want you to pay too much attention to this, because one of the joys of reading mystery, right, is to solve the mystery, but not solve it too easily, right? There's nothing worse than a mystery where you go, I know what it is on the second page.
Oh, that reminds me too, that was one of the, sorry for another little short comment, but the, one of the things about specifically our genre and mystery and crime genre is that you tend to be writing to an audience that reads a lot of these kinds of things and are essentially, and I don't mean this in any real negative sense, so please understand the context, but the reader and the writer are adversaries in the sense that you guys are all really smart readers and you've read a lot of books like the ones that we write, so you're trying to outthink us. And that forces us into a number of modes of faking you out in a number of different ways, double, triple reverses, all this kind of stuff. So that is another thing that's very important to both mystery fiction and our kind of fiction is escaping from the reader's feeling that they can already predict what's going to happen and making them feel helpless enough that we can then take them where we want to.
And one of the structures that we haven't mentioned yet is the caper plot, which is also delightful, and that's all about misdirection. And one of the keys to having a successful caper is you have to show the audience, the reader, all the pieces. If you can't cheat,
No.
and like that's some of the later Ocean's films cheated by having things happen on screen. It has to all be happening in front of the viewer with that misdirection going on. So when you get that click at the end, and suddenly they can just walk it back and piece it all together and get that incredible dopamine rush of having solved this puzzle.
Absolutely. And that's also where what Guy said about smoke and mirrors comes in, is you have to keep saying you're doing that misdirection. So, go ahead.
Just to tailgate on that comment, part of the danger of putting a caper or a fair play mystery with fantasy is you can't give in to the impulse to make magic too powerful or too loose. You have to have a solution to the problem that the reader can understand, anticipate, and feel satisfied by. And if it just turns out to be too easily done by magic, it all unravels.
Well, and that's the hard part about writing this. So let me follow up with this question. What do you do in your books so that magic isn't the answer, but the people solving the puzzle is the answer, if that makes any sense? Do you want to start with that? Or wait, Susan, you want to start with that?
Sure,
Okay, yeah. I think you almost have the answer to the question in the question, and that is that you need to be aware that that is a potential downfall and have that plotted into the beginning. The other thing I think that's really important is to ensure that the magic is, limited. I mean, that's a very basic thing of all fantasy, that if you have too much magic, you don't have a story because there's no stakes. So keep knowing your rules of magic and keeping them limited.
Yeah, exactly. Keep them limited and address it early on with your detective, your investigator, whoever is trying to unravel the mystery. Find out a way for them to bring it up, address it directly with the reader, so that the reader understands what those boundaries are.
I nearly shot myself in the foot with this, writing a series about the main character is a necromancer, which gives her certain abilities when it comes to speaking with the dead, finding out things that happen to the dead, and then I'm writing a series of murder mysteries. It's like, well, this can't be obvious. So there's a lot of, well, they were killed in a way that they didn't see their killer, and now I can't summon their ghost, and is that relevant or not? And so you have to come up with all these little workarounds to make things harder for your characters.
And I would go back to something I said earlier, which is the very loving adversarial relationship which we have with readers. And so the first thing is you have to assume the readers are as smart and as well-read as you are as a writer, right? That's the tragic fatal mistake is ever to write down to any audience, but especially to an audience as familiar with this kind of stuff as our audience tends to be. But at that point then, the one thing that you can do is you can actually use the reader's familiarity and tendency to say, oh, I've seen this before, and you start doing, as I mentioned, a double and triple reversal. The one where, it's like I've just gone blank on the name of it, but the Princess Bride scene with the poison in the chalice, that whole thing. But because he is clever, he would think that I'm doing this. So, you want to play those games, and you need to play them in more than one way. You need to, every now and then, you have to do the obvious thing, just so that the reader doesn't go, oh, he's tricking me, he always tricks me, or she always tricks me, or whoever it may be, they always trick me. But, you have to give them every kind of reversal or non-reversal, so that essentially the reader loses, I say this sounds so mean, but the reader loses faith in their own ability to outguess you, at which point they are at your mercy. But the only way to do that, because our readers are smart, is we have to work really hard to keep them off balance with a variety of different subterfuges that will make them think, oh, I got that right, and then you whip the carpet out from under them. But then the next time you give them one, they're going, okay, it couldn't be that, it's too obvious. But it was! It was exactly what it looked like. And you keep playing these games over and over again because the readers know what they're doing and they've read a lot of books, so.
Okay, I have a lot of little things that I want to have you guys talk about, okay? So, let's start with this. This is a combination of things. First of all, a lot of people are pantsers, and personally, I think that if you're a pantser, it's harder to write a mystery because you've got to plan your clues, right? So, how do you approach writing?
Anybody out there who doesn't know what Di is talking about?
Pantser, plotter.
Pantser.
A pantser just sort of starts writing and writes
Seat
the
of the
story.
pants.
And seat of the pants. Wait, and investigates, discovers the story as they write. And then plotters plot everything out. Okay, so how do you approach your mysteries, and how do you make it work for yourself, no matter what kind of writer you are? And then second of all, tied into that is one of the things as a reader that I hate is when there are clues that happen off the page and then they're revealed at the end as a key clue that I was never given, and so therefore I could never solve the mystery on my own. This pisses me off.
All right, that's book throwing time.
Yes. So, tied into that plotting thing is that necessity that everything has to make sense, and there's no deus ex machina, right? There can't be. So, Dan, you kind of try start.
Well, I just discovered there's a word called plancer. And it's a combination of the two. And what I love doing is breaking out a plot so that I can hit those key beats and those key clue points when the reader is going to start snapping things together. And then I organically feel the way through it with the characters. Because if I shove the characters in the direction I want to go naturally, it's going to feel off. So I try to honestly ask myself at every moment, would the character do that? Would they go out and get straight to the bad guy? In which case, there's bars on the window. They can't do that. They just eliminate all their options until logically.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. Follow up to that. Do you already have your characters planned before you plan out the clue line, the clue sort of thing, or do you sort of figure out the history and et cetera, and then sort of figure out what characters would be involved in this, and then kind of help figure that out? Or which way do you start? How do you put those together?
Yes. What I like doing is going through it multiple times. And what I'm doing is I'm weaving together all these individual threads. And I know they're not right each time, but as I go through and pass through each time, I'm pulling them tighter and tighter, and I'm forming this tapestry that's slowly coming into focus. And there is a magic moment when you give it just the right tug, and it all just snaps together, and you can see it. And it doesn't matter how many times I end up like shaking underneath my dining room table, telling myself that I'm crazy. It's worth it for that moment where it all just kind of pops together. I just love it. And I'm sorry, one thing, you were talking about the clues. Remember that people tend to pay attention to real estate very extensively in the books. They pay attention to the first chapter and the last chapter, the first paragraph of the chapter, the last paragraph of the chapter, the first sentence and the last sentence. If you want to hide something in plain sight, put it in the middle of the sentence, paragraph, chapter.
So yes, I'm definitely a planner. I'm an ultra planner. I have grids and charts and all of that. And I'm sure there's somebody who can give me an alternative point of view here, but I myself would have a really hard time understanding how you could really write a mystery that if you didn't plan it, I think it would be really tough. Or you'd be doing a heck of a lot of rewrites in order to get all those details and what have you. But, you know, besides plancers and planners and fanciers, there's also quilters. Quilters will look at a central scene of a story or a series of scenes that maybe get to key thematic moments, and they write those and then they quilt them together. So that's another one as well. But in terms of structuring a mystery in particular, I think one key and critical thing that you need to know is the relationship among, particularly between if it's a murder mystery, say, the murderer and the victim. You need to know what is that relationship and how did this whole thing come about, and then the triangle part, of course, is the detective. What is the relationship in there? Because in a mystery, if it begins with a murder, the crime has already been committed, one of the big questions is, how does all of this affect the detective? You know, why is that particular person important, and how are they drawn emotionally into the story? There's a wonderful moment in the movie Deja Vu, where the detective has interviewed the victim's father, and the victim's father gives him a photograph of her to take away. And he says, oh, it's not necessary, I don't need this. But the father says, no, you do need this. She needs to be important to you. And of course, there is a personal relationship that develops in that film. Getting to the second part of your question there around the clues and how do you do it, there's a lovely little technique that you can use from time to time called Lenny Gets a Clue. If there's anybody who has ever seen a very popular long-running television show called
Blue's Clues?
Law and Order. There was a character named Lenny who was a policeman, and you can look at this and you can see how much it's structured. Lenny gets a clue. He goes and he interviews somebody. He does not get the answer to his clue, but he gets a different clue, and he follows that one up. Listen, handy little tool to use.
I'm still, what was the name of the show? Did you hear?
Law and Order.
Oh, Law and Order, of course. I'm not too bright.
I am definitely a discovery writer. I like outlining, reverse outlining in the middle of the book is useful, but at the beginning, it's all exploration. And I go back and revise a lot. But one of the things that will usually happen to me is I will write something in a scene, in passing, because it seemed cool, or it seemed like something the character would do, or it's just an interesting background piece. And then as I'm going through several passes later, I will realize that that thing is very important. And most of the time, I can trust my subconscious to layer in the things it needs to put the plot together, and then I just have to find them and put the focus on them.
Can I just say that happens to me too? However, I am terrified every time I write that it won't.
Okay.
And
It's
this is a
horrible every
fear
time.
I live with.
And one of the things that I like doing with clues specifically is you need to give the reader information, but you don't have to give it in the right context. You can have characters walking through the background, snippets of conversations. The protagonists can know facts, but not the meaning behind those facts. Like you might be able to figure out, I'm pretty sure who the killer is, but do you know why? Do you know the killer's relationship to the victim, and why was this important? And I like misdirecting it through motive, if not through method.
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm very glad to have the term plantser, because when I had originally heard this particular, I don't know what you'd call it, a metaphor for how people write, I had heard it as you're either a seat in the pants or you're an architect. And so, because I'm both, I had always been having to call myself a pantsitect, which just doesn't really, I don't know, I didn't really embrace that one. I have a problem that the rest of you may or may not have, I'm not certain about this, which is that I write very long multi-volume stories. And one of the things about very long multi-volume stories that is difficult is that oftentimes by the time you are finishing the book, writing the last bit, solving all those final mysteries, etc., the earlier books have already been published. So if you got something wrong that you now realize, uh-oh, I did not, I gave the wrong clue, or I had that wrong when I did it. As I have often said, it's your choice is either just live with it or spend a lot of time going door to door, finding people's copies and going, can I have that part there where it says dead here, just breathing shallowly? So what's super important for me, and this is maybe not as germane if you're not writing multi-volume, if you're writing single-volume stories where you get a chance to do all of your editing before it hits the marketplace and is locked down in black and white, is I have what I call a sort of creative, what is the good term for it? It's kind of a creative mystification where I will have certain places that I know are going to come up in the ending, and they're going to be crucial. But I don't know yet exactly what they're going to do, how it's going to pay off, what it's going to mean. Because although I've done a lot of planning and have actually figured out some things to lay in as normal clues or whatever, in the foreshadowings, whatever they might be, in the early volumes that I'm going to pay off later, I haven't obviously been able to think of the rest of a 1,000,000-word story that's going to take me 4 more years to write. And some of that's going to come as I go. So what I do is I actually have these little node points that I can throw into the story that are clearly significant. So the reader sees them as an ordinary clue. And they say, something here is, I'm going to have this revealed to me later on. And if I do it right, and then do manage to figure out what was actually happening there and how to pay it off later on, when the reader gets to that point, they go, oh, that sly dog. Look what he did, all this. And the fact is, I didn't know crap when I was writing that. I just put that in there and made it look obviously significant and went, I'll figure that out later on. But that requires a certain kind of creative vagueness that, that you can then pull off and go back and explain afterwards that, well, that, see, they were saying that, and